The candles had barely been lit when the doors of the great hall swung open, and every head turned at once. Eleanor stood near the tall windows, a glass of wine untouched in her hand, when she heard her husband's voice rise above the music. It was not the voice she knew from 21 years of quiet mornings and shared meals. It was cold, practiced, aimed not at her, but at the crowd around them. "I have made a decision," Edward announced, and the musicians stopped playing one by one until only silence remained. "After careful thought, I have decided to end my marriage to Eleanor. Her origins are not suited to the name of this house." For a moment, Eleanor thought she had misheard him. The ballroom, filled with the same lords and ladies who had toasted their anniversary only a year before, seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She set down her glass carefully, as though the smallest sound might shatter more than crystal. "Edward," she said quietly, stepping toward him, "what are you saying?" He did not look at her. His eyes were fixed somewhere past her shoulder, on a woman standing near the far wall, dressed in deep green, watching the scene with an expression that was almost satisfied. Eleanor recognized her, Margaret Voss, the daughter of a wealthy merchant family who had been circling Edward's social gatherings for the better part of a year, always polite, always present, always somehow in the right place at the right time. "I am saying," Edward continued, his voice steady in a way that felt rehearsed, "that this marriage no longer serves the future of this family. I have consulted with my solicitors. The papers will be drawn within the month." A murmur spread through the room like wind through dry grass. Eleanor felt every eye on her, felt the weight of 2 decades collapsing in a single sentence. She had given this man her youth, her loyalty, 2 children, and countless nights of worry when his ventures failed, and she had quietly found ways to mend what he could not fix himself. And now, in front of the very people who had once called her gracious, elegant, beloved, he was discarding her, as though she were an old coat gone out of fashion. 21 years, she said, and her voice, though soft, carried across the silent hall. 21 years, Edward, and you tell me this in front of strangers. They are not strangers, he said. They are our peers. And it is only right that they hear it from me, plainly, rather than through gossip. Eleanor looked around at the faces she had known for so long. Lady Pembroke, who had once wept on her shoulder after losing a child. Lord Ashby, who owed his position at court to a quiet word Eleanor had put in on his behalf. None of them met her eyes now. They looked instead at their shoes, at their glasses, at anything but the woman being unmade before them. "You will be given a fortnight to gather your belongings," Edward said, finally turning to face her directly. There was something in his eyes that might have been guilt, buried deep beneath the pride he wore like armor. "The house in Weldon Lane will be prepared for you. It is modest, but comfortable." "A fortnight," Eleanor repeated. "You have decided my fate before telling me, and now you offer me a house, as though it were a kindness." "It is more than many would receive," he said, and there it was again, that practiced coldness, as if he had spoken these words to himself in a mirror, until they no longer hurt him to say. Eleanor felt her son Henry's hand on her arm before she saw him approaching. He was 20 now, tall like his father, but with her own quiet steadiness in his gaze. Beside him stood Charlotte, 17, her eyes wide and glistening, caught between the father she admired and the mother she loved without condition. "Father," Henry said, his voice low but firm, "this is not the way to do this. Not here, not like this." "It is done, Henry," Edward said. "I would rather it be plain and public than whispered about in corners for months." "Plain and public," Eleanor echoed, and for the first time since he had spoken, something steadied inside her. The shock was giving way to something quieter, something that felt almost like clarity. "Very well, Edward. If this is how you wish it to be remembered, then let it be remembered exactly as it happened." She turned to the room, to the frozen faces of people who had eaten at her table and danced in her home. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Thank you all for your years of friendship," she said. "I hope it was real, at least on your part, even if tonight suggests otherwise." With that, she walked toward the door, her back straight, her steps unhurried. Charlotte moved to follow her, but Eleanor shook her head gently. "Stay, my love," she whispered. "There is no need for you to leave with me. This is not your shame to carry." "It is not yours either," Charlotte said, tears finally spilling over. Eleanor touched her daughter's cheek, memorizing the warmth of it, and then continued walking. Behind her, she heard the murmurs begin again, low and hungry, the sound of a story already being reshaped into gossip before she had even left the room. Outside, the night air was sharp and clean, a relief after the suffocating heat of the ballroom. Eleanor stood on the front steps of the house that had been her home for 2 decades and looked up at the stars, steadying her breath. She would not cry here, not where anyone might see through the windows. She had given this family too much dignity to lose it now, in a fit of tears on the front steps. Her carriage was not yet ready, so she walked instead toward the gardens at the side of the house, the paths she had planted herself in the early years of her marriage, when Edward had still looked at her the way a man looks at someone he cannot imagine living without. The roses were in late bloom, heavy and fragrant, indifferent to the ruin happening just beyond the garden wall. She thought of her mother, long past, who had raised her alone, in a small cottage on the edge of a market town. She thought of the stories her mother used to tell, about a man who had once loved her deeply, but had been forced away, by circumstances neither of them could control. Eleanor had always believed those stories to be little more than comfort, the kind of tale a lonely mother tells a fatherless child to soften the absence. She had never once imagined that there might be truth buried beneath them, truth that would matter now, of all times. A voice behind her broke the quiet. "My lady," it was George, one of the younger footmen, his face pale in the moonlight. "Your carriage is ready. And, my lady, I am sorry. For what it is worth, many of us in this house never forgot your kindness." Eleanor managed a small smile. "Thank you, George. That is worth quite a lot tonight." As she climbed into the carriage, she caught one final glimpse of the house, glowing with candlelight. Laughter, already returning to the windows, as though nothing had happened at all. She did not look back again. The journey to Weldon Lane was short, but it felt endless. Eleanor watched the familiar streets pass by, streets she had walked as the Duchess of Ashcombe, greeted with bows and curtsies, now watching them slip away, as if she were already becoming someone else, someone smaller, someone forgotten. The house waiting for her was indeed modest, a narrow building with ivy climbing one wall, and a small garden gone slightly wild. A single housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Baxter, greeted her at the door with a lantern and a look of quiet sympathy that suggested she already knew everything. "I have prepared the front room for you, my lady," Mrs. Baxter said. "It is not what you are used to, I am afraid." "It will do," Eleanor said, and meant it. After the humiliation of the evening, simplicity felt almost like relief. She did not sleep that night. She sat instead by the small window of her new bedroom, watching the moon travel slowly across the sky, replaying the moment again and again, the music stopping. Edward's voice, flat and rehearsed. Margaret Voss, watching from the corner with quiet satisfaction. She began to understand, slowly, that this had not been a sudden decision. It had been planned, arranged, perhaps discussed among people who had never once considered that Eleanor herself might have thoughts, feelings, a voice of her own. By morning, word had already begun to spread through London. She could tell by the way Mrs. Baxter avoided her eyes over breakfast, by the way the milkman lingered a moment too long at the door, clearly hoping to catch a glimpse of the disgraced Duchess. Eleanor ate her toast in silence, and resolved, in that quiet moment, that she would not spend her remaining years hiding from a scandal that was not of her making. She would need answers, not from Edward, whose explanations would only ever serve his own comfort. She would need to understand why, after 21 years, he had suddenly decided that her origins mattered. She had never hidden where she came from. Her mother had been a seamstress. Her father, as far as she had ever known, a man who vanished before she could remember his face. It was a humble beginning, certainly, but not a scandalous one. Not enough on its own to justify the cruelty of the previous night. Something else was at work here. Something Eleanor could not yet see, but which she was determined to uncover. She thought again of Margaret Voss, standing in green silk, watching the destruction of a marriage, as though it were a performance, staged entirely for her benefit. There was more to this than pride and prejudice against her humble birth. There was strategy in it, calculation, the kind of quiet manipulation that took months, perhaps years, to arrange. By the second day, a young woman appeared at her door, notebook in hand, introducing herself as Grace Milton, a writer for one of London's more widely read gazettes. Eleanor almost turned her away, but something in the woman's manner, direct without being unkind, curious without being cruel, made her pause. "I do not wish to add to your suffering, my lady," Grace said, "but I believe there is more to this story than the Duke has told anyone. I would like to help you find out what that is, if you will let me." Eleanor studied her for a long moment. Trusting a journalist went against every instinct she had cultivated over 2 decades in society, where words were currency and secrets were weapons. But something about Grace's steady gaze reminded her of herself, years ago, before marriage had softened her sharper edges. "Come in," Eleanor said finally. "But understand this. If you intend to use my pain for your own gain, I will know it, and I will not forgive it easily." "I understand," Grace said, stepping inside. "And I promise you, my lady, that is not my intention." As the door closed behind them, Eleanor felt, for the first time since the previous night, a small flicker of something other than grief. It was not quite hope, not yet. But it was the beginning of a question she intended to answer, no matter where it led her, or what it might reveal about the life she thought she had always known. Outside, the city moved on as it always did, indifferent to the quiet storm gathering behind the ivy-covered walls of a modest house on Weldon Lane. But inside, a woman who had been discarded in front of all of London was beginning, slowly and deliberately, to rebuild herself into someone far harder to dismiss. Grace Milton sat across from Eleanor at the small table in the front room, her notebook closed for now, resting on her lap as though she understood that trust had to be earned before questions could be asked. Mrs. Baxter brought in tea, her hands trembling slightly as she poured, still unaccustomed to serving a woman who had once commanded an entire household of her own. "You do not have to speak with me today," Grace said gently. "I only wanted you to know that I am here, and that I intend to look into this properly, not simply repeat whatever the Duke's circle chooses to say." Eleanor wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for something solid to hold. "What do you already know?" "I know that the announcement last night was public and deliberate," Grace said. "I know that Margaret Voss was present, and that she has been seen at several gatherings, hosted by the Duke over the past year. I know that her family's fortune has grown considerably in recent months, though the source of that growth is not entirely clear." Eleanor absorbed this slowly. She had noticed Margaret's presence before, of course, but had never imagined it as anything more than the ordinary maneuvering of ambitious families seeking favor with a duke. Now, hearing it laid out plainly, she began to wonder what she had missed. "You believe there is a connection," Eleanor said. "I believe it is worth asking why a marriage of 21 years ended so suddenly, and why it ended in a manner designed to humiliate, rather than simply dissolve quietly," Grace said. "Men who wish to remarry do not usually need to destroy their first wife's reputation in front of half of London to do it." Eleanor set down her cup. "Then what would you have me do?"
"Nothing for now,"
Grace said. "Only allow me to ask questions on your behalf, quietly, among people who might speak more freely to a writer than to the Duchess herself. And if you learn anything, anything at all, about why this happened, I would ask that you share it with me, before anyone else." Eleanor considered this for a long moment. She had spent 21 years learning the unspoken rules of London society, learning which doors opened with a smile, and which closed with a single misplaced word. She understood, better than most, how easily a woman's reputation could be shaped by others, long before she had a chance to shape it herself. "Very well," she said finally. "But I will not be a puppet in this, Miss Milton. If I agree to help you, it is because I believe the truth matters, not because I wish to see my name in your gazette." "Understood," Grace said, and for the first time, she smiled, small and genuine. "I will begin by asking around about Margaret Voss's family. Something changed for them recently, and I intend to find out what." After Grace left, Eleanor sat alone in the quiet front room, listening to the distant sounds of the city beyond her small garden wall. She thought of her children, Henry and Charlotte, still living beneath their father's roof, caught in a position she could hardly bear to imagine. She had not seen either of them since the night of the announcement, though Henry had sent a brief note assuring her of his loyalty, careful in its wording, clearly written with the awareness that any letter might be read by prying eyes before it reached her. That afternoon, she walked through the small garden behind the house, pulling weeds from beds that had clearly been neglected for years. It was humble work she had not done with her own hands since childhood, yet she found a strange comfort in it. The soil did not care who she had been the night before. It simply needed tending, and she found she was glad to give it. As she worked, her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to her mother. She had died when Eleanor was only 22, shortly after Eleanor's marriage to Edward, and in her final months she had grown quieter than usual, often staring out the window of their small cottage, as though watching for someone who never arrived. Eleanor had always assumed this was simply grief, the slow fading of a woman who had worked hard her whole life, and had little left to look forward to. Now, she found herself wondering if there had been something more behind that distant gaze, some memory her mother had carried alone for decades. She remembered, faintly, a name her mother had spoken only once, late one evening when she thought Eleanor was already asleep. Charles. She had murmured it softly, almost tenderly, before falling silent again. Eleanor had never asked who Charles was. She had assumed, if she thought of it at all, that he was simply a friend from her mother's youth, one of the countless people who pass briefly through a life and leave only a name behind. That evening, as the sun set behind the rooftops of Weldon Lane, a letter arrived at Eleanor's door, carried by a boy who refused to say who had sent him. The paper was thick and expensive, far finer than anything Eleanor had seen since arriving at her new, humbler home. She opened it carefully, her fingers steady despite the strange unease settling in her chest. The letter was brief, written in a careful, formal hand. "My lady, I write to you regarding a matter of some importance concerning your family history. I believe there are details of your parentage that have long remained hidden, details that may be of significant relevance to recent events. I would ask that you visit my offices at your earliest convenience, alone if possible, so that we might discuss this privately. Yours in confidence, Albert Finch, solicitor." Eleanor read the letter 3 times before setting it down on the small table beside her. She had never heard the name Albert Finch before, had no memory of any solicitor connected to her mother's modest life, and yet something about the careful, deliberate wording of the letter made her chest tighten with an emotion she could not quite name. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to anticipation, the sense that a door long closed was about to be opened, whether she was ready for it or not. She did not sleep well that night, turning the letter over in her mind again and again. By morning, she had made her decision. She would go to this solicitor's office, not because she trusted a stranger's word so easily, but because she could no longer ignore the small, persistent voice inside her that whispered there was more to her own story than she had ever been told. She dressed simply, choosing not to draw attention to herself as she made her way through the streets toward the address written on the letter. The offices of Albert Finch were tucked into a quiet lane near the financial district, unremarkable from the outside, the kind of place one might walk past a dozen times without ever noticing. Inside, a clerk led her to a small office, where an older man sat behind a cluttered desk, his expression difficult to read. He rose as she entered, offering a small, formal bow. "My lady, thank you for coming," he said. "I understand. This must be a strange and perhaps unwelcome intrusion, given the circumstances of recent days." "You understand correctly," Eleanor said, taking the seat he offered. "I would ask that you explain yourself quickly, Mr. Finch. I have had quite enough surprises this week." "Of course," he said, folding his hands together on the desk. "I represented a client for many years, a man who passed away several months ago. Before his death, he asked me to locate a woman named Eleanor, born to a seamstress, in a market town some 50 years ago. It took considerable effort to confirm that you were, in fact, the woman he sought." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "And who was this client, Mr. Finch?" The solicitor studied her for a long moment, as though weighing how much to reveal, and how quickly. "His name," Mr. Finch said slowly, "was Charles Whitmore. Though in certain circles, my lady, he was known by a rather different title altogether." Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly, the same way it had tilted 2 nights before in the ballroom of her former home. The name Charles, spoken so long ago in her mother's tired voice, rose suddenly in her memory with new and startling weight. "Go on," she said quietly, though every part of her already sensed that whatever came next would change everything she thought she knew about herself. Mr. Finch reached into a drawer of his desk and withdrew a leather folder, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. He placed it before Eleanor but did not open it, as though giving her a moment to prepare herself before the contents changed her life for good. "Before I show you what is inside," he said, I must explain some history, so that none of this comes as a shock too sudden to bear. Eleanor nodded once, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Charles Whitmore was, for most of his life, known publicly as a merchant of modest success, Mr. Finch began. But this was not the truth of his birth. He was born the second son of the Earl of Denholm, a family with old land and older debts. As a second son, he stood to inherit little, and so he was sent away in his youth, to make his own fortune, as was common practice among such families. That still does not explain why my mother would have known him, Eleanor said. I am coming to that, Mr. Finch said patiently. During his years building a modest trading business, Charles met a young seamstress in a market town. Your mother. They fell deeply in love, my lady, though their circumstances made any future together nearly impossible. His family, upon learning of the attachment, threatened to cut him off entirely if he pursued a marriage so far beneath what they considered proper. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. So he left her. It is not quite so simple, Mr. Finch said gently. There was more at stake than family pride. Charles had, in his business dealings, made powerful enemies, men who did not take kindly to losing contracts to a rising merchant, with new methods and new alliances. When one of these rivals discovered his attachment to your mother, he made it known that harm would come to her, and to any child they might have, if Charles did not disappear from her life entirely. Eleanor stared at the folder on the desk, unable to move. He left to protect her. He believed it was the only way to keep her safe, Mr. Finch said. He never stopped watching over her from a distance, my lady, though he could never risk revealing himself. When his elder brother died without an heir, some years later, Charles unexpectedly inherited the title of Earl of Denholm, along with considerable land and fortune. But by then, your mother had already married another man, briefly, before that man abandoned her, and Charles, having built a new life under his mother's family name to avoid drawing attention, chose never to reveal his presence, fearing it would only endanger you both further. Then why, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper, did he never come forward, not even after the danger had passed? Pride, perhaps, Mr. Finch admitted, or shame at having stayed away so long that he no longer knew how to return. He watched you marry the Duke of Ashcombe from a distance, my lady. He attended your wedding, in fact, seated quietly among the guests, though you would have had no reason to notice an unfamiliar older gentleman among so many faces. Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to steady the flood of emotion rising within her. 21 years of marriage, and the man who had watched her walk down the aisle had been her own father, hidden in plain sight, too afraid or too ashamed to claim her. He passed away only a few months ago, Mr. Finch continued, having lived his final years in quiet regret over the choices he made. In his will, he named you as his sole heir, my lady. The title of Earl of Denholm cannot pass to you directly, as it follows the male line, but the estate, the fortune, and several properties are entirely yours, along with a substantial claim to influence within certain circles that even the Duke of Ashcombe cannot easily dismiss. Eleanor opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were documents bearing seals she recognized from her wedding day decades before, letters in a handwriting she had never seen but which somehow felt achingly familiar, and a single portrait, small and worn, of a young man with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. He looks, she whispered, like Henry, my son. The resemblance was noted by several who knew him, Mr. Finch said softly. Blood, it seems, does not forget itself so easily, even across generations kept apart. Eleanor sat in silence for a long while, the weight of the revelation settling slowly over her like a heavy blanket. She thought of her mother's quiet sadness in her final years, the way she used to stare out the window as though waiting for someone who would never come. She had not been imagining things. She had been mourning a love that circumstance had stolen from her, a love she had never spoken of aloud, for fear of endangering the daughter she had raised alone. Why come to me now, Mr. Finch? Eleanor asked finally. Why not years ago, when he was still alive? He asked me to wait, Mr. Finch said. He believed that revealing himself while you remained married to the Duke might complicate matters unnecessarily, might even endanger the standing of your children. He intended, I believe, to reach out eventually, in his own time. His death came sooner than any of us expected. Eleanor thought of the timing of it all. The sudden and cruel announcement at the ball only days after this solicitor had likely begun the quiet process of confirming her identity. A cold suspicion began to form in her mind. Mr. Finch, she said slowly. Who else knew that you were searching for me? The solicitor's expression grew troubled. I was discreet, my lady. But discretion in London is rarely absolute. I made certain inquiries among clerks and record keepers in recent weeks, verifying documents related to your birth and your mother's history. It is possible, though I cannot say with certainty, that word of my search reached ears I did not intend. Eleanor felt a chill settle over her, despite the warmth of the small office. If someone had learned that she stood to inherit a fortune and a connection to one of the oldest titles in the country, someone close enough to the Duke to warn him, then perhaps the humiliating announcement at the ball had not been about her humble birth at all. Perhaps it had been about preventing her from ever claiming what was rightfully hers, or worse, about ensuring that whoever orchestrated her disgrace would be positioned to benefit once the truth came to light. She thought again of Margaret Voss, standing in green silk, watching the destruction of a marriage with quiet satisfaction. She thought of the sudden growth in the Voss family fortune that Grace Milton had mentioned only the day before. Pieces that had seemed unconnected began, slowly and unwillingly, to arrange themselves into a shape she did not yet fully understand, but which filled her with a deep and steady resolve. Mr. Finch, she said, closing the folder carefully and holding it against her chest. I believe I understand now why my husband chose this particular week to end our marriage in such a public and cruel fashion. My lady? Someone learned what you had discovered, she said, rising from her chair. And someone decided it was better to discard me before I could learn the truth myself, before I could claim what belongs to me. I do not yet know who that someone is, precisely, but I intend to find out, Mr. Finch, and I would be grateful for your continued assistance in doing so. You have it, my lady, Mr. Finch said, rising as well. Your father made me promise to see this through properly, whatever it required. I do not intend to break that promise now. Eleanor left the solicitor's office with the leather folder clutched carefully in her hands, stepping out into the busy street with a strange new lightness beneath the weight of everything she had just learned. She was no longer simply a discarded duchess, cast aside for humble origins. She was the daughter of an earl, heir to a fortune, and a legacy she had never known existed, and she suspected, with growing certainty, that her own husband's cruelty had been carefully engineered by someone determined to keep that truth buried. As she walked home through the crowded London streets, she found herself, for the first time since the terrible night of the ball, standing a little taller, her steps a little steadier. Whatever game had been played against her, she intended to learn every rule of it, and to play it far better than those who had underestimated her. Grace Milton returned to Weldon Lane 2 days later, her face flushed from hurrying through the streets, a folded newspaper tucked beneath her arm. Eleanor invited her in at once, sensing that whatever news the young writer carried would not wait for tea to be poured. I have learned something troubling, Grace said, settling into the chair across from Eleanor without waiting to be asked. I spoke with a clerk who works in the records office, the same office where Mr. Finch made his inquiries about your birth. He told me that a woman matching Margaret Voss's description visited only days after Mr. Finch's search began, asking questions about the very same records. Eleanor's hands stilled over the teacup she had been about to lift. She knew then, before I did. It appears so, Grace said. And there is more. I asked around about the Voss family's recent fortune, as I told you I would. It seems their sudden prosperity is tied to a series of investments made only weeks ago. Investments in land holdings that, until recently, belonged to the estate of a man named Charles Whitmore. The Earl of Denholm, Eleanor said quietly. Yes, Grace confirmed. It seems Margaret Voss's father purchased several parcels of land from the estate before your father's death was even made public, at a price far below their true value. I cannot yet prove how he came to know the sale was possible, or why the estate's own solicitors allowed such a transaction to proceed so quickly, but the timing is difficult to explain as mere coincidence. Eleanor set down her cup, her mind working quickly through the implications. If the Voss family had somehow learned of her father's death and his intentions toward her before the news became public, they might have acted swiftly to secure whatever advantage they could, land, connections, perhaps even influence over the Duke himself, before Eleanor could claim her inheritance and the standing that came with it. You believe Margaret Voss orchestrated my husband's decision, Eleanor said slowly. I believe it is worth asking whether the timing was hers to arrange, Grace said carefully. A woman who learns that a duchess is about to inherit a fortune and a connection to one of the oldest titles in England might see considerable advantage in ensuring that Duchess is discarded before she can claim it, especially if she hopes to take the Duchess's place herself. Eleanor rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out over the small garden she had begun to tend with her own hands. The pieces continued to fall into place, each one darker and more deliberate than the last. Her husband's sudden coldness, his rehearsed cruelty at the ball, the swift timing of it all, arranged not out of any genuine concern for lineage or propriety, but out of calculated greed dressed up as principle. "I need to speak with Edward," Eleanor said finally, turning back to face Grace. "Not to beg him to reconsider our marriage, you understand. I have no wish to return to a man who could discard me so easily, but I believe he does not fully understand what he has been used for, and I intend to make certain he does." "Are you certain that is wise?" Grace asked. "He may not welcome such a conversation." "I am no longer concerned with what Edward welcomes," Eleanor said, and there was a new steel in her voice that had not been there only days before. "I am concerned with the truth, and with ensuring that whoever engineered my humiliation does not profit from it undisturbed." That afternoon, Eleanor sent a brief note to the house that had once been her home, requesting a private audience with the Duke. She expected refusal, or at least delay, but a reply arrived within hours, brief and formal, agreeing to receive her the following morning. The house felt strange to her when she arrived, familiar in every detail yet somehow foreign, as though she were visiting the memory of a life rather than the life itself. A footman she did not recognize led her to the study where Edward waited, standing near the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture stiff and guarded. "Eleanor," he said, his voice careful, "I did not expect you to seek me out so soon. Nor did I expect to be discarding 21 years of marriage in a ballroom full of strangers," she replied evenly. "It seems we are both capable of surprising each other, Edward." He winced slightly at that, though he said nothing in response. "I have not come to plead with you," Eleanor continued, taking a seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. "I have come to tell you something I believe you do not yet know, though I suspect, once you hear it, you will understand a great deal more about the woman who has been guiding your decisions these past months." "What are you speaking of?" Edward asked, his guarded expression flickering, just slightly, with uncertainty. "My father," Eleanor said, "was not a disgraced merchant, as I long believed. He was Charles Whitmore, Earl of Denholm, and upon his recent death, he named me his sole heir. A fortune, Edward, and a connection to one of the oldest titles in England, both of which I only learned of myself a few days ago." Edward's face went pale. "That is not possible. I would have known." "Would you?" Eleanor asked. "Or would Margaret Voss have simply ensured you learned only what suited her purposes? Her family recently acquired land from my father's estate at a remarkably low price, land they could not have known was available unless someone informed them of his death before it became public knowledge. I believe, Edward, that Margaret knew of my inheritance before either of us did, and that she saw considerable advantage in ensuring I was discarded before I could claim it." Edward sank slowly into the chair opposite her, his earlier composure crumbling into something closer to disbelief. "She told me your origins would embarrass the family further, that there were rumors circulating about your mother that would eventually surface and damage our children's prospects. She seemed so certain, so well-informed." "She was well-informed," Eleanor said, "because she had been investigating my family's history for her own gain, not out of concern for yours. Tell me, Edward, when did Margaret first suggest that our marriage had become a liability?" Edward's silence stretched long enough to answer the question on its own. "It was shortly after Mr. Finch began asking questions at the records office," Eleanor said gently, watching the realization settle over her former husband's face. "You were not acting out of pride in our family's name, Edward. You were acting on information carefully placed in your ear by a woman who stood to gain everything from your decision, and who very likely intends to become the next Duchess of Ashcombe now that I am conveniently out of the way." Edward put his head in his hands, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed, though Eleanor felt no satisfaction in his distress, only a quiet, tired sadness at how easily he had been led. "I have made a grave mistake," he said finally. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "You have, and I am not certain, Edward, that I have any wish to help you correct it, at least not where our marriage is concerned. But I do intend to ensure that whoever manipulated you into humiliating me does not walk away untouched by the truth. She rose to leave, gathering her gloves from where she had set them on the small table beside her chair. "Eleanor," Edward said, his voice suddenly small, "what will you do now?" Eleanor paused at the door, considering the question carefully before she answered. "I will discover the whole truth, Edward," she said, "and then I will decide what to do with it. You may wish to consider, in the meantime, whether the woman you have chosen to trust deserves the position she is so clearly working to secure." She left the study without waiting for a response, walking back through the halls of her former home, for what she suspected would be one of the last times, her mind already turning toward the next step in unraveling the careful scheme that had cost her 21 years of marriage, and nearly cost her the truth of her own family as well. News of Eleanor's true parentage did not stay quiet for long. Grace Milton, true to her word, waited until she had gathered enough confirmed detail before publishing a careful, measured account in her Gazette, one that presented facts rather than rumor, though facts alone were enough to send a wave of astonishment through London society. Within days, the story was on the lips of every household, from the grandest townhouses to the humblest shops along the market streets. The Duchess who had been cast aside for her common origins was, in truth, the daughter of an earl, heir to a fortune that dwarfed even the Duke's own considerable wealth. The very families who had watched in silence as Edward humiliated her at the ball now found themselves scrambling to recall the details of their own behavior that night, wondering whether their silence had marked them as unkind in the eyes of a woman who might soon hold more influence than any of them. Eleanor received a flood of letters in the days following the Gazette's publication, some from old friends, suddenly eager to reaffirm their loyalty, others from acquaintances she barely remembered, now hoping to secure her favor before her new position in society became fully established. She read each letter carefully, sorting them with the same quiet discernment she had once used to manage her husband's household affairs, setting aside those that felt genuine and dismissing those that reeked of opportunism. Henry arrived at Weldon Lane one afternoon, his expression a mixture of pride and lingering hurt. He embraced his mother tightly before either of them spoke a word. "I should have stood beside you that night," he said finally, pulling back to look at her. "I have thought of little else since." "You are here now," Eleanor said gently. "That is what matters." "Is it true?" Henry asked. "About your father, about the Earl of Denholm?" "It is true," Eleanor said. "Your grandfather, Henry, though he never had the chance to know you, nor you him." Henry was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this. "Charlotte has been unbearable to live with since the news broke," he said finally, a small smile breaking through his earlier solemnity. "She insists on telling anyone who will listen that her mother is secretly the daughter of nobility, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world all along." Eleanor laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised her with how easily it came. "Tell her I would like to see her, when she is able." "She will come the moment I return home," Henry said. "She has been asking permission from father for days, though I suspect she will come whether he grants it or not." Later that same week, Charlotte did indeed arrive, practically running up the garden path before Eleanor had even opened the door. Their reunion was tearful and warm, and for a few precious hours, Eleanor allowed herself to simply be a mother again, free from solicitors and scheming rivals, and the weight of a fortune she had not yet fully learned to carry. But the quiet did not last. Grace Milton returned once more, this time with news that shifted the entire shape of the unfolding scandal. "Margaret Voss has requested a meeting with you," Grace said, settling into her now familiar chair in Eleanor's front room. "She sent word through an intermediary this morning, asking whether you might receive her privately, away from public attention." Eleanor considered this for a long moment. "What do you make of it, Grace?" "I believe she understands that her scheme is unraveling," Grace said. "The Gazette's story has made her position considerably more difficult. If it becomes widely known that she manipulated the Duke using stolen or improperly obtained information about your father's death, her family's reputation, and her prospects of ever becoming Duchess will be ruined entirely." "Then perhaps," Eleanor said slowly, "she wishes to negotiate before that ruin becomes complete." "Will you see her?" Grace asked. Eleanor thought of the woman standing in green silk at the ball, watching her humiliation with quiet, satisfied eyes. She thought of the land purchased at a fraction of its worth, the careful timing of Edward's announcement, The years of quiet manipulation that had cost her a marriage and nearly cost her the truth of her own family. "Yes," Eleanor said finally. "I will see her. There are things I wish to say to her directly, and things I suspect she wishes to say to me as well." The meeting was arranged for 2 days later, at a small tea house away from the busier parts of the city, chosen deliberately for its privacy. Eleanor arrived first, taking a corner table where she could watch the entrance, her nerves steadier than she expected, given the significance of what was about to unfold. Margaret Voss arrived precisely on time, dressed simply for once, without the elaborate silks and jewels Eleanor remembered from the ball. She looked, Eleanor thought, considerably less certain of herself than she had that terrible evening. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Margaret said, taking the seat across from Eleanor with visible hesitation. "I confess, I am curious what you hope to gain from this meeting," Eleanor said, her tone even, giving nothing away. Margaret was quiet for a moment, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I did not intend for things to go as far as they did," she said finally. "I believed, when I first learned of your father's fortune, that there might be some advantage in ensuring your marriage ended, before you could claim your inheritance. I will not pretend otherwise, my lady, but I did not anticipate how publicly, or how cruelly, Edward would choose to carry out the separation." "You underestimated your own influence over him, it seems," Eleanor said. "Perhaps," Margaret admitted, "or perhaps I underestimated how far ambition can carry a person, once they have convinced themselves that the ends justify whatever means are required to reach them." Eleanor studied her for a long moment, searching for insincerity in her expression, and finding, to her mild surprise, something that looked almost like genuine regret. "What is it you want from me, Margaret?" Eleanor asked directly. "You did not request this meeting merely to offer a confession." Margaret's composure faltered slightly. "I want to know what you intend to do with what you have learned. My family's fortune, my own prospects, everything now depends on whether you choose to pursue this publicly or allow it to fade quietly, as such scandals often do." Eleanor leaned back slightly in her chair, considering her answer carefully. She thought of the years she had spent building a life within Ashcombe's walls, only to have it dismantled in a single evening, for the benefit of a woman's ambition. She thought of her father, watching from a distance for decades, too afraid to claim the daughter he loved, and how that same fear of consequence had nearly allowed his estate to be quietly stolen from beneath her, before she even knew it existed. "I have not yet decided," Eleanor said finally, and it was the truth. "But I will tell you this, Margaret. I do not intend to be cruel, simply because cruelty was shown to me. I intend, however, to ensure that whatever happens next, happens because I have chosen it, not because you, or Edward, or anyone else has decided it on my behalf. You would do well to remember that, going forward." Margaret left the tea house without further argument, her earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the uncertain posture of a woman who had gambled a great deal, and was only now beginning to understand the true cost of losing. Eleanor remained at the table a while longer after Margaret's departure, watching the quiet street outside the window, turning over the weight of the choice now sitting squarely in her own hands. For the first time since that terrible night at the ball, she felt something settle within her, that was neither grief nor anger, but a steady, clear-eyed sense of her own power, to decide what came next. Edward's household grew quieter in the weeks that followed, though not in the peaceful way Eleanor might once have wished for him. She heard reports of his troubles through Henry, who visited often now, and through the careful, measured updates Grace Milton continued to bring, gathered from her network of clerks, footmen, and shopkeepers, who saw and heard far more than most people realized. The Gazette's story had done more damage to Edward's standing than he had anticipated. Society, ever fickle in its loyalties, had begun to whisper that a duke who so easily discarded a wife of 21 years, only to discover she was heir to a greater fortune than his own, had shown himself to be a man of poor judgment rather than firm principle. Invitations that had once arrived at his door in steady supply began to thin. Old friends found reasons to delay their visits. The Voss family, once eager to align themselves with the Duke's household, grew noticeably distant as their own fortunes came under quiet scrutiny. Edward requested a second meeting with Eleanor, this time sending the note himself rather than through a footman, his handwriting less steady than she remembered from years past. Eleanor considered refusing, but curiosity, and perhaps a small measure of lingering compassion for the man she had once loved, led her to agree. They met in the same study where their previous conversation had taken place, though Edward looked considerably diminished from the confident figure who had once commanded that room with ease. He did not wait for pleasantries before speaking. "I have made inquiries of my own since we last spoke," he said. "It seems Margaret Voss's father purchased the land from your father's estate through a clerk who had been paid to share information before it became public. I have already informed the appropriate authorities of what I discovered." "That is a start," Eleanor said carefully, "though I confess I am surprised you took the trouble." "I owe you at least that much," Edward said, his voice heavy with something that sounded, for the first time, like genuine remorse rather than mere embarrassment at his own poor judgment. "Eleanor, I have spent every day since that night replaying what I said to you, in front of everyone we knew. I told myself, at the time, that I was protecting our family's name. I see now that I was protecting nothing but my own pride, manipulated skillfully by a woman who understood exactly which fears to exploit." Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, studying the man across from her, searching for the trace of the person she had married 2 decades before. She found it, faintly, beneath the weariness now etched into his features. "I am not asking you to return to me," Edward said quietly. "I understand that whatever trust once existed between us has been damaged beyond simple repair, but I would ask, if it is not too much, for your forgiveness, even if it changes nothing between us going forward." Eleanor considered his words carefully before responding. "I have spent a great deal of time these past weeks discovering who I truly am. Edward, separate from the name Ashcombe, separate even from the title of Duchess I carried for so long. I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I do not carry the same anger toward you that I expected to. You were foolish and easily led, but I do not believe you acted out of true cruelty, not in your own heart." "Then you forgive me?" Edward asked, hope flickering briefly across his tired features. "I forgive the man who was manipulated," Eleanor said. "I have not yet decided what I feel toward the man who allowed himself to be manipulated so completely, without once pausing to ask me directly what truth might lie behind the rumors he was fed. That, Edward, is something you will need to earn back slowly, if you wish to earn it at all." Edward nodded, accepting this with a quiet dignity that Eleanor had not expected from him. "What will become of Margaret Voss's family, do you suppose?" "I understand an investigation has already begun into the clerk who sold information from my father's estate," Eleanor said. "Whatever consequences follow will follow according to the law, not according to my own personal wishes. I have no desire to ruin a family out of spite, though I confess I feel little sympathy for those who orchestrated such deception for personal gain." "And what of us, Eleanor? What happens now, between you and I?" Eleanor rose from her chair, considering the question, with the same careful deliberation she had brought to every decision since that terrible night at the ball. "I am the Duchess no longer, Edward, not in any way that matters to me now. I am Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of Charles, Earl of Denholm, and I intend to build a life that reflects that name, rather than clinging to a title that was taken from me so publicly and so cruelly. Whatever relationship remains between us, if any, will need to be built on entirely new terms, terms that respect who I have become, rather than who I once was content to be." She left the study for what felt, this time, like a true and final departure, walking through the familiar halls of the house without the heaviness that had accompanied her earlier visits. Outside, the autumn air was crisp and clear, and Eleanor found herself walking slowly through the streets, rather than calling for a carriage, savoring the quiet freedom of simply existing as herself, unburdened by the expectations that had shaped so much of her adult life. That evening, Mr. Finch called upon her at Weldon Lane, carrying additional documents related to her father's estate. The properties, it seemed, were more extensive than she had initially understood, including a country house in Denholm that had remained largely unused since her father's final years, staffed by a small but loyal household who had continued their duties out of respect for a man they had quietly cared for, despite his reclusive habits. "Would you consider visiting the estate, my lady?" Mr. Finch asked, as they reviewed the documents together at her small kitchen table. "There are those among the household staff who knew your father well, and might offer insights into his life that even these papers cannot fully capture." Eleanor considered this for a long moment. Yes, she said finally. "I believe I would like that very much. It is time, I think, that I learned more about the man who loved me from a distance for so many years, even if he never found the courage to close that distance himself." As Mr. Finch gathered his papers to leave, Eleanor found herself standing at the window of her modest front room, watching the last light of day fade over the rooftops of Weldon Lane. The path ahead of her remained uncertain in many ways, filled with decisions yet to be made about Edward, about Margaret Voss and her family, about the shape her new life would eventually take. But for the first time since the humiliation of that terrible evening, Eleanor felt genuinely, quietly hopeful about what lay ahead, rather than merely determined to survive it. The journey to Denholm took the better part of a day, the London streets giving way gradually to open countryside, hedgerows heavy with the last blooms of the season, fields stretching gold and green toward a horizon Eleanor had never before had reason to see. Henry accompanied her, having insisted on the journey the moment he learned of her plans, and Charlotte had begged so persistently to join them that Eleanor found she had not the heart to refuse. The house itself came into view as the carriage crested a gentle hill, a handsome stone building softened by ivy and framed by ancient oaks that had clearly stood for generations before any of them were born. It was smaller than Ashcombe, less grand in its architecture, but there was a warmth to it that Eleanor felt even from a distance, a sense of quiet dignity rather than ostentatious display. A small staff had gathered at the entrance to greet them, led by an older woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper who had served Charles Whitmore faithfully for nearly 30 years. Her eyes filled with tears the moment she looked upon Eleanor's face. "Forgive me, my lady," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "It is only that you have his eyes, exactly his eyes, and his smile as well, though I see it rarely enough that I nearly forgot, until this very moment." Eleanor felt a lump rise in her own throat as she took the older woman's hands in hers. "Thank you for caring for him all these years, Mrs. Pruitt. I understand he was not always an easy man to know." "He was quiet," Mrs. Pruitt agreed, leading them inside. "Kept mostly to himself, especially in his later years. But he was kind, my lady. Kind in the way of a man who carries a great sorrow, but refuses to let it curdle into bitterness. He spoke of you often, though he never gave your name, not until the very end." "What did he say of me?" Eleanor asked, as they walked through halls lined with portraits of ancestors she had never known existed, faces that bore, in subtle ways, echoes of her own features, and even, more strikingly, of Henry's. "He said he had a daughter somewhere in the world who did not know he existed, and that this was the greatest regret of his life," Mrs. Pruitt said softly. "He used to sit in his study for hours, writing letters he never sent, my lady. I believe Mr. Finch has them still, if you wish to see them." Eleanor did wish to see them, more than she could easily express, and that evening, after Henry and Charlotte had settled into their rooms, and the house had grown quiet around them, she sat alone in her father's study, with a small stack of letters Mr. Finch had left for her, each one addressed simply to "my daughter," though none had ever been sent. She read them slowly, one, by candlelight, learning of a man who had thought of her on every birthday, who had followed news of her marriage and her children's births through careful, discreet inquiries over the years, who had wept, according to one particularly tender letter, on the day he learned of Charlotte's birth, grieving that he would never hold his own grandchildren, never see them grow, never be more to any of them than a distant shadow watching from afar. In the final letter, dated only weeks before his death, his handwriting had grown noticeably weaker, though the sentiment remained as steady as ever. "My dearest Eleanor, though you have never heard that name from my lips, know that I loved your mother deeply, and I have loved you from every distant circumstance forced upon me. I leave you what I can, though I know it cannot replace the years I failed to give you. Forgive an old man's cowardice, if you are able, and know that not a single day passed in which you were not in my thoughts." Eleanor set the letter down gently, allowing herself, finally, in the privacy of her father's quiet study, to weep freely for the man she had never known, and now never would. The following days at Denholm brought a gentler kind of healing than Eleanor had expected. She walked the grounds with Henry and Charlotte, learning the small details of the estate that would soon be entirely her own responsibility. She spoke at length with Mrs. Pruitt and the other members of the household staff, gathering fragments of her father's life, like pieces of a puzzle, slowly forming a complete picture. She learned that he had funded, quietly and without public credit, a small school in the nearby village, and that he had been known among the local tenants as a fair and generous landlord, slow to raise rents even in difficult years. He was trying to be a good man in the ways he still could, Henry observed one afternoon, as they walked together along a path bordering the estate's small lake. Even if he could not be the father he wished to be. Yes, Eleanor agreed. I find I understand him better with each day we spend here, even as I wish, more than anything, that I might have known him while he still lived. On their final evening at Denholm, before returning to London, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor. Grace Milton arrived, having traveled from the city with news too important, she insisted, to wait for Eleanor's return. The investigation into the Voss family has concluded, Grace said, settling into a chair in the drawing room with evident urgency. The clerk who sold information about your father's estate has confessed, and it has become clear that Margaret Voss herself arranged the payment, using funds provided by her father, without his full knowledge of how they would be used.
What will happen to her?
Eleanor asked. Her family's reputation is severely damaged, Grace said. Several of their business partnerships have already been withdrawn, and it seems unlikely Margaret will find herself welcomed in the circles she once hoped to enter. Certainly not as anyone's Duchess. Her father, from what I understand, is furious with her, having discovered how thoroughly he was deceived regarding the true source of their recent land purchases. Eleanor absorbed this news quietly, feeling neither triumph nor particular satisfaction, only a settled sense that consequences, however delayed, had finally arrived where they belonged. She thought of her father's letters, of his quiet regret over choices made out of fear rather than courage, and she found herself hoping, despite everything, that Margaret Voss might yet find her own way towards something better than the ambition that had led her so far astray. Thank you for bringing me this news, Grace, Eleanor said, and thank you, truly, for everything you have done these past weeks. I do not believe I would have understood the full truth of my situation nearly so quickly without your help. It has been an honor, my lady, Grace said, though I suspect this is far from the last chapter of your story. A woman with your fortune, your title, and your evident resilience is not likely to fade quietly from London's attention, whatever you might personally prefer. Eleanor smiled at this, gazing out the window toward the darkening grounds of the estate that was now, in every sense, her own. Perhaps you are right, Grace, but whatever comes next, I intend to meet it as myself, fully and completely, rather than as anyone's discarded wife or forgotten daughter. That, I think, is the truest inheritance my father ever left me. Eleanor returned to London a changed woman, though few who saw her walking through the streets near Weldon Lane could have named precisely what had shifted in her bearing. She held herself no differently than before, spoke no louder, dressed no more elaborately than her modest means at the cottage had allowed. And yet those who encountered her found themselves treating her with a new deference, an unspoken acknowledgement that the woman before them commanded a respect no title alone could grant. Society, ever eager to realign itself with wherever influence now resided, began extending invitations once more, though Eleanor accepted few of them. She had grown wary of gatherings where warmth could vanish so quickly into cruelty, and she found she preferred the company of those who had remained loyal through her humiliation over those who now sought her favor, simply because her fortune had changed. Lady Pembroke, the same woman who had once wept on Eleanor's shoulder after losing a child, called upon her one afternoon, her expression heavy with genuine shame. I should have spoken up that night, Lady Pembroke admitted, sitting stiffly in Eleanor's small front room. I have thought of little else since. I am ashamed of my silence, Eleanor. Truly. You are not the only one who stayed silent, Eleanor said gently, though there was no bitterness in her tone, only tired understanding. Fear of scandal makes cowards of us all, at times. I do not hold it against you, Margaret, though I confess I have learned to value more highly those few who spoke or acted despite that fear. Then you will forgive me? Lady Pembroke asked hopefully. I already have, Eleanor said, though I hope, should such a moment ever arise again, that you will find your courage a little sooner. Not everyone who called upon Eleanor received such easy grace. When Lord Ashby, whose position at court owed much to a quiet word Eleanor had once put in on his behalf, arrived seeking to re-establish their friendship now that her fortune had been revealed, Eleanor received him politely, but with a coolness that left no doubt as to her true feelings. "I am glad to see you doing so well, my lord," she said, after a brief and stilted exchange of pleasantries. "Though I confess I find myself less inclined toward old friendships that reveal themselves only once fortune returns. I wish you well, of course, but I do not believe we have much more to discuss today." Lord Ashby left considerably more chastened than he had arrived, and word of the exchange spread quickly through London's drawing rooms, serving as a quiet but effective warning to others who might have considered a similarly opportunistic approach. Meanwhile, Edward's situation continued its slow decline. Without Margaret Voss's family connections to bolster his standing, and with society's growing disapproval of how he had treated a wife of 21 years, Edward found himself increasingly isolated within circles that had once welcomed him without question. Henry reported that his father had grown quiet and withdrawn, spending long hours alone in his study, rarely venturing out, except when business absolutely required it. "I do not know whether to feel sorry for him or not," Henry admitted to his mother one evening, as they sat together in the drawing room at Denholm during one of his frequent visits. "He brought this upon himself, and yet I cannot forget that he is still my father." "It is possible to hold both feelings at once," Eleanor said. "Sympathy for a man's suffering does not require excusing the choices that led him to it. I have found, in my own reckoning with him, that I can wish him well without wishing to return to what we once had." Charlotte, for her part, had grown noticeably more confident in the weeks since the scandal first broke, embracing her mother's new position with an enthusiasm that occasionally bordered on the theatrical. She had taken to introducing herself, at every opportunity, as the granddaughter of the Earl of Denholm, much to Henry's good-natured exasperation. "She has told the story to 3 separate shopkeepers this week alone," Henry reported, with the particular fondness of an older sibling recounting a younger one's harmless foolishness. "I believe she has embellished several details beyond what actually occurred." "Let her enjoy it," Eleanor said, smiling despite herself. She endured her own share of humiliation that night at the ball, watching her parents' marriage dissolve before her eyes. If a little pride in her family's true history brings her comfort, I see no harm in it. As autumn deepened into winter, Eleanor settled more fully into her new role, dividing her time between the quiet countryside of Denholm and the necessary business of London, where matters related to her father's estate required regular attention. She found, to her surprise, a genuine aptitude for managing the properties and investments left to her, drawing on skills she had quietly developed over years of managing Ashcombe's household affairs, skills Edward had rarely acknowledged but which now served her remarkably well. Mr. Finch remained a steady presence throughout this period, guiding her through the more complex legal matters of the inheritance with patient thoroughness. Under his advice, Eleanor established a small trust to support the village school her father had funded quietly during his lifetime, ensuring his legacy of unspoken generosity would continue openly, in a manner he himself had never felt able to claim. Grace Milton, meanwhile, had risen considerably in her own profession, her careful and accurate reporting on Eleanor's story having earned her a reputation for integrity that few of her peers could match. The two women had grown close over the months of their collaboration, and Eleanor found herself grateful for a friendship built not on the shifting sands of fortune and title, but on genuine mutual respect. "You have changed a great deal since that first night I called upon you," Grace observed one afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens at Denholm, now restored to their former beauty, under Eleanor's careful attention. "I have learned a great deal," Eleanor corrected gently, "about my father, about the true character of those I once considered friends, and perhaps most importantly, about myself. I was so long defined by my marriage, Grace, so accustomed to thinking of myself as the Duchess of Ashcombe, that I had nearly forgotten there was a woman beneath that title, one entirely capable of standing on her own." "And now?" Grace asked. "Now," Eleanor said, looking out over the grounds that stretched before them, gold and quiet beneath the pale winter sun, "I intend to make certain that woman is never forgotten again, by myself or by anyone else." Winter brought with it a formal event Eleanor had not anticipated attending so soon after the upheaval of the previous months, a gathering held at the residence of Lady Fairholme, one of the few society hostesses whose loyalty to Eleanor had never wavered, even during the darkest days following the ball. The invitation had been extended with genuine warmth rather than opportunistic curiosity, and Eleanor decided, after some consideration, that it was time to re-enter society on her own terms, rather than continuing to hide away at Denholm indefinitely. She dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a gown of deep blue silk that Charlotte had helped select, simple in its design but unmistakably elegant, a reflection of the woman Eleanor had become, rather than an imitation of the Duchess she once was. When she arrived at Lady Fairholme's grand townhouse, the room fell into a hush, not unlike the one that had greeted Edward's cruel announcement months before, though this silence carried an entirely different weight, one of respect rather than scandal. Lady Eleanor, Lady Fairholme greeted her warmly, using the title Eleanor had quietly adopted in place of her former one, acknowledging her father's line rather than her broken marriage. "I am so pleased you accepted my invitation. This house has missed your presence." "Thank you, Lady Fairholme," Eleanor replied, genuinely touched. "I confess, I was uncertain how I would be received." "Those who matter have always known your worth," Lady Fairholme said firmly. "The rest, I think, have learned an important lesson these past months, about the cost of cruelty, dressed up as principle." As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself the subject of considerable, if more respectful attention. Several guests approached her with genuine warmth, inquiring after her well-being and expressing quiet admiration for how she had conducted herself throughout the ordeal. Others, whom Eleanor recognized as having been present at the ball months before, approached more cautiously, their earlier silence clearly weighing on their consciences. It was during this gathering that Eleanor encountered Edward for the first time since their conversation at his study weeks before. He stood near the edge of the room, noticeably thinner than she remembered, his usual confident bearing replaced by a quieter, more subdued presence. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and Eleanor inclined her head in polite acknowledgement, before turning her attention back to her conversation with Lady Fairholme. Edward did not approach her directly that evening, though Eleanor noticed him watching her from a distance on several occasions, his expression difficult to read. It was only as the evening drew to a close, and Eleanor was preparing to depart, that he finally found the courage to speak with her. "You look well, Eleanor," he said quietly, appearing at her side as she waited for her carriage to be brought around. "Truly well. In a way I do not believe I ever saw during our marriage." "Thank you, Edward," Eleanor replied evenly. "I find that discovering one's true self, however painful the circumstances, brings a certain clarity that years of comfortable habit rarely allows." "I have heard of the trust you established for the village school near Denholm," Edward said. "It is a generous gesture, and a fitting tribute to your father's memory." "He gave what he could, in the ways he still felt able to," Eleanor said. "I intend to continue that legacy more openly than he ever felt free to do himself." Edward hesitated, clearly working up the courage to say something more. "I do not suppose," he said finally, "that there might ever be a place for me in the life you are building, even a small one." Eleanor considered this question carefully, aware that her answer, whatever it might be, would shape the remainder of whatever relationship existed between them going forward. "I do not know, Edward," she said honestly. "I have forgiven the man who was foolish enough to be manipulated by ambition, dressed as concern. I have not yet decided whether that forgiveness extends to rebuilding what was broken so publicly and so completely. Perhaps in time, it might, but I will not rush toward reconciliation simply because it would be convenient, for you or for society's expectations of how such stories ought to end." "That is fair," Edward said quietly. "More fair perhaps than I deserve." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed, without unkindness. "Good night, Edward. I wish you well, truly, whatever comes next for each of us." As her carriage carried her back toward Weldon Lane through the quiet winter streets, Eleanor reflected on how far she had traveled, not merely in the physical distance between Ashcombe and Denholm, but in the deeper journey of understanding who she truly was, separate from any title or marriage that had once defined her. She thought of her father's letters, of his quiet regret over choices made from fear rather than courage, and she resolved, watching the city lights pass by her window, that she would not repeat his mistake of allowing fear to dictate the shape of her remaining years. The following morning brought news from Mr. Finch that the investigation into the Voss family's dealings had concluded with formal consequences. The clerk who had sold information about her father's estate had been dismissed and faced legal penalties for his breach of trust. Margaret Voss herself, it seemed, had left London entirely, her family's reputation too damaged to sustain her ambitions within the society she had once hoped to conquer. Eleanor felt no particular triumph at this news, only a settled sense of proper conclusion to a chapter of deception that had cost her a great deal, though it had ultimately revealed a truth about herself and her family that she would not trade for anything, not even the comfortable ignorance of her previous life. "What will you do now, my lady?" Mr. Finch asked, as they concluded their business that morning. "The estate is fully settled, the investigation concluded, and society, it seems, has largely accepted the truth of your circumstances." Eleanor looked out the window of her small front room at Weldon Lane, considering the question with the same careful deliberation she now brought to every decision in her life. "I believe," she said slowly, "that I shall continue as I have begun, Mr. Finch. Managing my father's estate, supporting the school he funded so quietly, remaining close to my children as they build their own lives. I do not yet know whether Edward and I will ever find our way back to something resembling what we once shared, and I confess, I am no longer certain it matters as greatly as I once believed it would." "And Weldon Lane?" Mr. Finch asked, glancing around the modest room. "Will you remain here, now that Denholm is fully at your disposal?" Eleanor smiled softly at this. "I believe I shall keep this house as well, Mr. Finch, humble as it is. It was here, after all, that I first began to understand who I truly was, beneath every title I had ever carried. I find I am rather fond of it, for that reason alone." Spring arrived at Denholm with a quiet beauty that Eleanor had come to cherish deeply over the months since first learning of her father's legacy. The gardens she had restored bloomed in full color, and the small village school she had helped establish welcomed its first full term of students, their laughter carrying across the grounds in a way that filled the old house with a warmth it had long lacked during her father's solitary final years. Henry had taken to visiting frequently, developing a genuine interest in the management of the estate that reminded Eleanor, sometimes painfully, of the grandfather he had never known. He had begun studying the account books with Mr. Finch's patient guidance, learning the practical realities of land management, with an enthusiasm that suggested he might one day take up stewardship of Denholm himself, should Eleanor choose to pass it to him in time. Charlotte, meanwhile, had blossomed in her own way, her earlier theatrical pride in her mother's newfound status settling into a genuine and thoughtful appreciation for the history she had inherited. She had taken to reading her grandfather's old letters and journals with careful attention, piecing together the portrait of a man whose quiet sorrow had shaped so much of the family's hidden history. "I wish I could have known him," Charlotte said one afternoon, as she and Eleanor walked together through the gardens, the spring air fragrant with new blooms, "even for a little while." "He knew you, in his way," Eleanor said gently. "He watched from a distance, celebrated your birth in secret, grieved that he could not be closer. I think, in the end, that counts for something, even if it could never be enough." Edward's presence in Eleanor's life had settled, over the intervening months, into something neither of them had quite expected. He had written to her occasionally, careful and respectful letters that made no demands upon her time or affection, simply sharing news of Henry and Charlotte, or offering quiet observations about matters he thought might interest her. Eleanor had responded in kind, and slowly, without either of them quite naming it, a fragile new understanding had begun to form between them. Not a marriage restored, but perhaps the beginning of a genuine friendship, built on terms far more honest than those that had governed their previous years together. He visited Denholm for the first time in early spring, arriving unannounced but clearly nervous, standing awkwardly at the entrance, until Mrs. Pruitt ushered him inside, with the same brisk kindness she extended to all who visited the estate. "I did not expect to see you here, Edward," Eleanor said, meeting him in the drawing room where he waited, turning his hat over nervously in his hands. "I hope I have not overstepped," he said quickly. "I found myself wishing to see the place that has meant so much to you these past months, and I confess, I also wish to see you, if you would permit it." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, noting the genuine humility in his bearing, so different from the proud, rehearsed cruelty of the man who had discarded her in front of all of London less than a year before. "You have not overstepped," she said finally. "Come, let me show you the gardens. They are at their finest this time of year." They walked together through the grounds, much as Eleanor had once walked with Grace, and later with Charlotte, though this walk carried a different weight entirely, heavy with the history between them, and cautiously hopeful about what might yet be possible. I have thought a great deal about what you said to me that night at Lady Fairholme's gathering, Edward said, as they paused beside the small lake that bordered the estate's southern edge. About rushing toward reconciliation, simply because it might be convenient or expected. I do not wish to rush you now, Eleanor. I only wished you to know that I am here, should you ever find yourself willing to consider what we might yet build together, on entirely new terms. Eleanor considered this for a long moment, watching the gentle ripples across the lake's calm surface. I do not know what the future holds for us, Edward, she said honestly. I am no longer the woman who stood beside you at that ball, uncertain of her own worth, dependent on your name and title to define her place in the world. I am my father's daughter now, in every sense that matters, and I intend to remain so, regardless of whatever else might unfold between us. I would not wish it otherwise, Edward said quietly. I have learned, this past year, the cost of failing to see clearly the worth of what stood before me all along. I do not intend to make that mistake again, whatever form our future relationship might take. Eleanor smiled softly, a genuine warmth returning to her expression that had been absent during their earlier, more painful conversations. Then perhaps, she said, we might begin again slowly, as friends first, and allow whatever comes next to unfold in its own time, without the pressure of expectation weighing upon it. I would like that very much, Edward said, and for the first time since the terrible night of the ball, Eleanor found herself believing him completely. As the weeks turned into months, Eleanor's new life at Denholm flourished in ways she could not have imagined during those dark early days following her humiliation. The village school thrived under her patronage. Henry grew steadily into his role as her trusted advisor in matters of the estate, and Charlotte continued to blossom into a thoughtful young woman, proud of the true history her mother had uncovered. Edward's visits grew more frequent, though never overbearing, each one marked by a careful respect for the boundaries Eleanor had established. Whether their renewed friendship would eventually grow into something deeper, Eleanor could not yet say with certainty, though she found herself, increasingly, open to whatever possibility the future might hold. On a warm summer evening nearly a year after that terrible night in the ballroom of Ashcombe, Eleanor stood once more in her father's study at Denholm, the same room where she had first read his letters by candlelight, weeping for a man she had never known, but had come, in time, to understand deeply. She held in her hands a final letter, one she had written herself, addressed to the father who could never read it, expressing gratitude for the legacy he had left her, not merely in fortune and land, but in the quiet courage to rebuild herself entirely, on her own terms, when the life she had known was so publicly and cruelly taken from her. She placed the letter carefully, in the same drawer where she had found his own unsent words. A small gesture of connection, between a father and daughter, separated by circumstance for so many years, yet bound, in the end, by the same quiet strength that had carried them both through their darkest hours. Outside her window, the grounds of Denholm stretched green and golden beneath the setting summer sun, a legacy fully claimed, a future fully hers, and a life finally, completely, her own to shape however she chose.